Hi, this is Steve Buoniconti from SOA Consulting Services, continuing our Angular 4 tutorial on binding. We're going to go through several different examples and show you what you need to know with binding within Angular 4. The first example is called binding. We look at basic attributes and property binding. The second example is a binding template. We look at the ng-for and ng-if and the ng-switch directives, which help you add, remove, and include certain DOM elements. Then we're going to be talking about binding two-way, which is a two-way binding example. Let's move on. Okay, what I have here are three projects that are going to talk about binding. So let's look at the first one. It's the simplest one, but it's the most basic type of binding. Okay, so what do I have here? I created an Angular 4 project using Angular CLI within WebStorm, and it generated some things for me. Okay, first of all, I have an index.html. I have a main.ts driver. Okay, so let's look at the main.ts driver. It's bootstrapping an app module. So whenever you generate the Angular 4 project, this file gets created. It's the driver. Index.html is basically it has a custom app root tag in it, which defines my Angular app. And so if you notice inside the main.ts, we are bootstrapping an app module, and that app module is located here. So this is my app module that's getting that defines my application module, my root application module. So notice I have a custom component in app.component. It's in my declaration, and I'm importing the browser module. I've got no providers at the moment, but I am bootstrapping the app component. So this tells me that my root component is the app component. So let's go take a look at that. Okay, so the app component has the selector app-root. It's pointing to an app component HTML, a style sheet, and I have an exported class called app component, and I have a name string here which I just defined to be Godzilla. And there's also an onInput event. The onInput event has an argument of an event, and the target of that event, which is of type HTML input element, is retrieved and defined in this input element attribute. And then what I do is I log the input property value, and then I get the attribute of that value, and I log the attribute value. And then I look at this.name and I log that, and that is this particular attribute. And you could ignore this for now, but there is a simplest syntax in TypeScript which allows you to not have to take the target out of the event. You could just pass the target into the function. This uses what is called destructuring. So there's an additional syntax here which says grab the target value of the event. Okay, but we're not using this function. We're using this function here. Okay, so let's take a look at the template. We kind of know what the object does. Let's take a look at the template. The template has an input tag, and it bounds the property value to the name which is located in the app component. And then it also binds the attribute value to the name in the app component. And it says, when is an input event, invoke on input event and pass in the event. So let's first of all, let me go into bindings and start the project. That's going to fire up. That's actually going to run ng serve. Serve is the Webpack server which listens for changes as we change the app. So it starts running that server and then listens for changes and should dynamically rebuild and rebundle, etc. every time we make changes. Okay, let's look at the style sheet. Oh, I got some colors. I colored the div tag, the h1, etc. And I also have a global style for the web page. So whatever is defined in this directory is basically my app and my app module. I have the driver out here, and I have the index.html outside here. But here is my main root components and essentially my app module, which I'm running. This driver can run any different module. Okay, so it looks like it's compiled successfully. Now let's try to look at the developer tools. And let's change this to Godzilla 10. Let's just do one more. Godzilla 101. The input property value is Godzilla 101, but the input attribute value stays the same. And the name property value stays the same. So let's go take a look and see what we're talking about here. The name property starts out over here. The event that occurs gets the input, gets the event target HTML input element, and gets the value of that element. That's the property value. If you go to look for the attribute value, it's not changing as we're changing the input field. Angular is changing the property value. And the name property value is not changing either. So that's why as we change this particular input value, the property value is changing, but the attribute and the property name in the component is not. Now, with that said, this function could update this name value. And you could, in some sense, do other types of things here. But let's move on to the next example. Okay, let's look at the binding template. Okay, this is rather simple. We have a main.ts file that needs to be formatted. It bootstraps the app module. The app module is here, app module. Now the app module contains the browser, imports the browser module, ng module, forms module, HTTP module, and we also import the app component, which gets bootstrapped. Now we declare the custom components, we import the modules we need to import. We're not using providers with this example. And then we export the class app module. Now the app component imports a component. It has the selector app root. That's the one in the index.html. This is our root component. It has an external template, an external style sheet, and we define some attributes in the app component class declaration, right? We also export the class. We have a flag, a Boolean value, which by default is true. We have a foods array that I created because I'm going to iterate through a foods array using a directive. And I have a name string called Bob. So now, these values in my component, I could use directives in my template to operate on them. All right, so let's look at the template. The first thing I do is I have a button, and when you click it, the flag is toggled. We set flag equal to not flag. So this expression Angular evaluates that is when the button is clicked, the flag value in the component is negated. And then we use these directives, the double curly bracket, to render the value of the flag in the component. Okay, so this binding up here, the click, is going from template to component. This binding here is going from component to the template. And then we go through a couple of examples here. First, we show you what the star ng if can do to a span tag. The ng if looks at the flag, and if it's true, it renders itself. If it's not true, it does not. So flag is true will be shown when flag attribute is true, and it will not be shown when flag attribute is false. We do the same thing with the square bracket and if. And this directive is basically saying if the flag is true, render the template. Okay, now the third item is used quite commonly. We always forced to do this in Angular because we're always showing tables or we're always showing tables or div tags or a list of items. So this particular syntax, the ng4, is a directive which allows you to iterate through an array. So this let item of foods, this ng4 directive will iterate through the foods array. For each iteration, it'll define an item. And that item can be displayed. So here's the example here. We have a table of foods. We have a row in the table. And for each item of the foods array, we display the item. The let declares a variable item in this iteration which has its own scope. So item is the first value of the first iteration. It's the second value of the array in the second iteration, etc. So we should see a list of items here in the from the foods array showing up in the table of foods. Then you have a different directive, an item list with an ng switch case directive. And based on the name attribute of the component, the ng switch can test whether that value is Steve, Bob, or Jane. And if it's neither, then we use the ng switch default. So let's take a look, see where we are. Let's go to the binding template and start the application. Once again, Angular CLI is running a command which will invoke the Webpack server, which will monitor all changes. Okay, so as you can see, you have a template, you have a component. You basically have a component template. You have attributes of your component, and you use directives in your template to determine, to tell Angular what to do and how to do it. And there's strong data binding associated with the directives. So let's look at the values again. The flag is a boolean, it's true. Foods is an array of strings. Notice we're using a generic here, generic type. We defined an array of strings which correspond to foods. And then I have a name string is equal to Bob. Okay, so this is the app component, the blue. The greenish is the web page. So this blue area is our Angular app. Okay, so the flag's value is true. We saw that the default value of the flag was true in the component. Span, when we span with the star nf equals flag, the span value shows up. And notice the span tag, I specifically colored it in green so you could see that the span tag is showing, as well as the template. The table, where we say let item equal foods and we iterate through the foods using the table row, is showing up here. And I colored the style. I used the style for the table so that the table shows its markup fragment. And then I have an item list with ng switch case. Bob was the default value, so it says hello Bob. Now let's try to toggle a flag's value. Oh, these two span tags are no longer showing. Well, this is a span tag. This was a template. I put the template in a span tag so it shows up green. Flag's value is false. It doesn't show. It's true. It does show. Now notice the item list with ng switch case hello Bob. Let's try to change it. Let's make it Steve. Okay, let's do this. It should change, but let's try to change one of these. I'm going to try to remove pizza. A problem with the Webpack server sometimes. Okay, so basically the table, pizza got removed from the table, and we have hello Steve. Let me try one more thing, and I'll make a mess out of this. Let's try Mary, because the template is saying, you know, if if the value is Steve, do hello Steve. If it's Bob, do hello Bob. If it's Jane, do hello Jane. Otherwise, say name is not Steve, Bob, or Jane. Name is not Steve, Bob, or Jane. Okay, so that was an example. I think it was a good example to show some of the directives and the binding that goes on. We'll try to do we'll really delve into some more of that binding, a lot of other examples. Let's look at the last example. Let me shut this down. Okay, once again, index.html main.ts. Here's your driver. Okay, you're booting your app module that's in the app.module file. Your app.module okay, you got forms module, app component, and company component. Your declarations are for your custom components, excuse me, and your imports of the browser module, forms module. You don't have any providers, and you bootstrap the app component. So your app module bootstraps your root component, which is your app component, and you're using 2 custom components in your declarations. Okay, so let's look at the components. You got application and you got company. The application has a selector called app_root. That's the tag that's used in the index.html. It has its template and its style sheet externalized. Let's look at the template. The template of the app_root component uses a company search tag. There's a child component, which is a company component. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so your company component has the selector company search. So that is the child component, company component. You're exporting the class company component. You have a company name string. And in your constructor, you set a timeout with the fat operator, arrow operator. You say, with the set timeout function, define this company name to be SOA Consulting Services after 2 seconds. So basically what it's doing is saying, define the value of this company name after 2 seconds. And then the template of the company component states this is a company component and has an input field that's typed text with a placeholder and enter company name. And this syntax is the two-way binding syntax. Bind the company name to this input value so that when the component attribute value changes, the HTML value will change. And when the HTML value changes, the back component company name attribute will change. So what this next line does is just shows the value of the company name from the company component. Let's take a look at, let's run the example. Okay, once again, we have an app component, which is the root component. This tag is rendered in the HTML. This app component is the root component. It has a template with a child, which is a company search selector. And we look at the company component. The company search selector is here, and there's a component that gets constructed, and 2 seconds later the value of company name is defined. Now what I've done here is the main page has some body background color, turquoise. The app component is rendered with a Dodger blue, and the company components register with like a light green. So when you see the component, when you see the web page, you got the web page as turquoise, you got the main root app component as Dodger blue, and you've got the child company component as light green. Now, let me just render this again and reload the page. Or let's do this. You notice, enter company name, and then 2 seconds later, the company name shows up. Basically what happened is, after 2 seconds, the component attribute company name was rendered, was initialized. And at that point, there was some code here, the double curly bracket that says, give me the value of that component attribute. And also, there was a directive that insisted on it getting rendered in this text field. When I change the input field, that value was bound to the component attribute, company name attribute. That value was changed, and then it went back out to the template where I used a double curly bracket interpolation operator to show me the value. So that's really what I wanted to show you. I think if you, I don't know if most of you might program like me. I like coloring my different markup fragments. I like to know initially what I'm talking about. It's good visually to see, oh, I've got some spacing over here. Maybe I don't want that. And it's good to understand visually what's happening with the components. Anyway, stay tuned for more tutorials from Steve Bonacontri at SOA Consulting Services.